Welcome to the Westside Barbell podcast. Today's episode, I'm joined by our new co-host, Burley Hawk. Burley, pleasure to have you here.
Good to be here, Tom.
Anyone watching is going to see we have a different layout, a different backdrop. I think it's one of the most iconic backdrops we could ask for, in that we have all the old school Westside Barbell equipment that has made us new home here in our headquarters office, where people can still come visit, come train in some of the most iconic pieces we have. Having Burley here offers us a good insight into how we work with athletes, and we can bounce stuff back and forth rather than trying to break something down on a kind of a mono style format. Right now we have about 10 athletes, give or take, in situ in our HQ gym. We had to separate out the gyms for two big reasons. One is that the equipment here carries a lot of history and legacy to it. We don't want to take from that. We don't want to add new pieces to it, nor are we going to take pieces out from it. It represents our foundation, where we came from, and to pay it the respect it deserves. It should be here for all people to come visit, use, and be like as it was when Louis passed. The HQ facility for athletes next door allows us to experiment more with professional athletes in all different disciplines, for us to do some more experiments, always trying to push everything Louis taught us to the next level, to the best of our ability, while always paying homage to here. I think a good place to start is where the athletes are now. We have a couple who are in fight camp. Lance right now is in Vegas trying to sign a fight for overseas. Miles is coming off a fight, so he's going through a recovery process. Dante, Max, Justin, or Dante, Max, Lawson, and Joe, they are all grapplers, which I have found to be very interesting demographic to work with, in that there's technically no season.
Yeah.
And having no season means you don't have the luxury of building up with max effort, dynamic effort, and tapering in to where you got to choose big competitions and you got to keep training all year round, which is very similar to how you would have trained with the powerlifting crew. What's been your take on working with jiu-jitsu athletes or grapplers?
Well, I think the big thing is that the presence of absolute strength is extremely important. And I think we've discussed this prior, that I think a lot of jiu-jitsu athletes and grapplers are starting to understand that, before a lot of guys would stay away from heavy weights or even weight training period because they thought that it would take away from their, their technique and skill. But I think, Dante's proven both in, his weight class, and then, he won, there's no limit weight class,
Yeah.
whatever that was, absolute, they call that. I mean, he was beating guys, 230, 240 pounds. So, when you mix absolute strength with black belt, high-level technique, you really start to create monsters. And even explosive strength training, too. A lot of guys stay away from that, particularly athletes. They stay more in the realm of speed training, conditioning training. But I think, our system has proven that, if you develop explosive power and a high capacity of absolute strength, you create really dangerous, fighters and grapplers.
For sure, and it's chasing achievable and consistent records in an absolute strength for max effort training.
Yeah.
It's great to hit that 15, 20 pound PR, but we're pretty pumped if we're chipping away at 5 pound PRs every week.
Yeah.
A big thing that we've changed, I'm not sure if you implemented the same for your dynamic effort, is that we do a combined dynamic effort day. And the reason this was done was, it started with working with Matt Brown back in about 2012. We wanted to give more day for skill acquisition.
Mm-hmm.
And we messed around with the 4-day, 5-day, 2-day, 1 day a week, you name it, we messed around with it. But 3 days really kind of was a sweet spot in giving an athlete an extra day to dedicate towards recovery, skill acquisition, whatever they needed. They had more time to make that decision with. And dynamic effort day became the most important day of the week, nearly, because we are having training so dense, so conditioning is not an issue. We're just adjusting rest periods. Been able to do dynamic upper and lower in one workout and alternate the accessory works base for each one. It carries over to athletes and sports a lot better than having the separation of days, because when I'd watch you guys train, I forgot, especially my first 3 years here, is that you're in a sport of absolute strength.
Yeah.
And this is your SPP2. You're in the gym is like going to a football field or the ring or the octagon.
Practice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you kind of forget about that. I think some strength coaches do forget about that. Like we're a cog in the wheel. Like we have a level of importance, but it's not the only importance for an athlete.
Yeah.
When you're in strongman or powerlifting, absolute strength is paramount.
Yes.
And there's ways to get there. There's some optimal, some suboptimal, but basically you're trying to get as strong as possible. Mm-hmm. These guys here are trying to get as strong as necessary. Mm-hmm. And obviously we want them to be as strong as necessary, but at the top of the pile in their weight classes, or they're given discipline. But the conditioning aspect of that has carried over to where in 3 weeks, they're seeing huge carryover and the max efforts don't go backwards. Initially, speed strength reduces until they adapt to the training. And again, we're chasing adaptation, avoiding accommodation. But within 3 weeks, it comes right back and there's no loss. In fact, sometimes they pick up speed. And then the introduction of plyometrics, of which I wanted to pick your brain on because you're a lot more into plyometrics than I am. And I realize like it's a big thing that we're lacking right now. So we're trying to program it in. So where did your fondness of the importance of plyometrics come into your athletes training?
Well, I think with athletes, it's high return with really a low amount of fatigue. I mean, obviously you don't want to overjump athletes because then that risk injury, and especially if an athlete's jumping in a fatigue state, they can make mistakes and break a kneecap or something on a box. But unless you're using the soft box, but we got the some of the old school ones. But I think there's a development of explosive power and speed and the low risk factor. As long as an athlete is used to doing athletic things. I mean, if you're talking about a football player, a basketball player, martial artists, they're used to changing direction fast. They're used to jumping, being explosive. So it's just a really easy way to improve speed, explosive power. Honestly, I mean, if you're jumping, sometimes we do like 4x10 jumps.
Yeah.
That also, aside from the explosive power, the plyometric aspect, there's still a work capacity aspect there. So it kills a lot of birds with one stone, and I think it great return on investment. Based on the lower risk. And it's a great introductory way to explosive power training versus throwing an athlete into a dynamic effort. Squat situation. Mm-hmm. Plyometrics is like low barrier of entry.
How do you deal with the term individualization of training? And what I mean by that is a lot of people say they do individualized training and it's one-on-one to that athlete, which I agree with you. You have to train them as they are. But for here, the group dynamic is so important in that I want to get the athlete up to a level of readiness where they can jump into a group.
Yeah.
And the Lou approach is you watch from 10,000 feet and then you might pull someone aside and go, hey, you should be working on this, this, and this, and do it in your own time, but never remove that group dynamic. How do you approach that?
Well, same way Lou approached it. I think the best way to go about it is, if you start with a group, situation, and then you can bring everybody up to what you would expect to be somewhat of a similar level. But as that, the group starts to grow, you can kind of see glaring weaknesses or glaring issues, lack of traits in certain athletes. And then from there, you make adjustments. Like in the gym, Lou would do the same thing with, strength athletes. If he's seen you need something extra after, the main exercise is done, he would pull you aside and say, hey, the group's going to go and do, say dumbbell presses.
Yeah. You
maybe need to do more, incline press or overhead, seated overhead press or something like that. So I think that what really, you have to start, it's kind of like a funnel, right? You start with a wide selection of exercises. You start with, a group dynamic, but then on an individual level, you start to pick different strategies for each person based upon the weaknesses and the issues that present themselves. Or, some athletes might have issues with fatigue, or they're not as in shape as the rest of the group, so you might have to modify training, to a degree there. But then that's also why we used to do multiple training groups where it was kind of leveled, or by weight class or different, experience level. A lot of ways to design training to make sure everybody's getting what would be considered an individualized approach. And if I may, I think sometimes guys get too obsessed with individualization of a training program, and you get too specific with somebody who maybe would, you're pulling out of the toolbox too quickly tools that could be used later because you're just not using the basics now. You're using a excavator for a job a shovel will do, if that makes sense.
You nearly create a groove without knowing it. That you're so individualized, you forget everything else.
Yeah.
Of which, like, really, to truly be good at anything, you should be a generalist.
No, I agree with that. And if you're, I think a true athlete adapts, right? So you shouldn't need to have your hand held. I think a lot of times the individualization obsession, it starts with the competitiveness in the coaching realm where coaches want to differentiate themselves from the next guy.
Yeah.
So they, present to the athlete or the customer, the client, well, my level of individualization is at a higher level than your current coach, so I'm a better coach. Well, no, maybe you're just being more of a salesman than a great coach. I'm not saying that, having an individualized approach isn't a good way to train an athlete, but you need to, there's a road to individualization. It's just not something you should really start with right off the bat. And I think, Louis proved that the best way is to start with the group and then, like we said, just pick what they need past what the group can offer, or what the plan for the group is offering.
Well, I think two people think that there's only 3 workouts and that's it, you're done.
Yeah.
That's 3 workouts here. But if you're a professional athlete, you're doing small workouts too. And those are nearly as important because that's where you can really be specific.
Yeah.
And to where, like, okay, here's a weakness we've identified, let's try and improve upon it. The 3 workouts we're doing is kind of like that North Star. We know, is the accessory you're doing right? Are you getting stronger? Are you slowing down? Are you conditioned?
Yeah.
And that feedback loop allows us to adjust on a weekly basis to that. And like that's the you're right, like to where an athlete should be a generalist, but they can adapt, and they can adapt so fast.
Yeah.
And the power of the group, which it was interesting seeing you work with Tommy and Mac yesterday. When you get so used to working with athletes your way, sometimes you forget to look at other coaches and how they work. And when you're doing rollbacks, I can see Mac was going, what are we doing here? Because he was keeping a strict high elbow.
He was pretty much doing a hammer style skull crusher. Yeah.
And then maybe just to expand on that, the way you approach, just say rollbacks compared to how I would approach them is different. But like I was so interested in, and maybe you want to talk about that, how you approach that.
Well, it's really the old school Westside rollback, right? And it's primarily focused on tricep strength development, and obviously, growing the tissue. And the big thing is, like Lou would always say, we really want to focus on, thickening that tricep tendon for, to assist in elbow extension. And, obviously in our focus, it was for the bench press, the overhead press, the incline presses for pressing. But really the way we approach it is, the triceps are the primary focus, but it's really an upper torso exercise. So there's secondary aspects to it. You have upper back, posterior shoulder, even, grip to some extent because the forearm training, because you have to control the dumbbells. You can't just collapse them. It's a controlled movement. It's a precise movement. So, but yeah, it's just really the old school Westside way. But in the same way, like you discussed, that the athletes, sports athletes aren't going to be as big as strength athletes. So there's more, range of motion. So they might not get the same stimulus out of traditional rollback at times that, a bigger guy will, especially like we were talking about the size of the dumbbell heads. If you are using a lighter dumbbell, like a 20 pound or a 30 pound or a 40 pound, you're going to have issue getting the movement down right because the dumbbells just aren't big enough to allow you to do the movement right. The range of motion is almost is too much, right? Too much of a stretch at the tricep tendon.
When you're working with strength athletes, bigger strength athletes, is there a lot that goes unnoticed that you can't do what you do with maybe someone who's 180 to 200 pounds than someone who's 350? Because if you take, just say, a linebacker against a wide receiver or like different levels or weights and powerlifting, are mechanics different how you execute exercises and recovery?
Oh, well, yeah. The movements will be different, right? Just the execution. And I think a big thing with obviously bigger guys, they're going to be more durable and resilient, right? So you've got more room for error.
Mm-hmm.
When you're dealing with an athlete that's, doesn't have the bone density, the joint size of a super heavyweight powerlifter, you have to be a little bit more careful to not put them in a position they could hurt themselves because they're not going to have, the physical structure or the absolute strength capacity to get themselves out of a bad spot that could, result in, say, excessive spinal flexion or, an issue like that.
Are you a stickler for technique?
I think that strength drives technique. I would never allow an athlete that I'm training to come in and exhibit bad technique, because obviously that's a reflection of me as a coach. But I also don't pick apart technique because I think that, especially if it's an experienced athlete, they know how to move. So once we go over the basic parameters of a movement, I try to allow the athlete to adapt that to what they believe is best for them or what their skill set is. Or But yeah, I try not to be too obsessed with it, and I also try to understand that, absolute strength drives technical capability. So every athlete if a new athlete's starting with barbell training, they're going to have shit technique because they're just not strong yet. And as long as we're focused on enhancing absolute strength and developing, the technical execution, it'll all come together without having to obsess over the situation or having them squat with a fucking broomstick over and over and over.
It's kind of you want them to get have as fast a possible route into the system as possible. And we had this conversation multiple times about if you're brand new to lifting, and only if you're brand new to that there is a certain level of value starting on a linear approach for a short space of time to get competent with movement, technique. The same with if you've never squatted before, you should free squat and then box squat, not just do box squat only. And to actually get to know your body, because there's people who come in and they got no clue what they're doing. Well, two, they don't respect weight.
Yeah.
You forget weight is not forgiving. It's it's 100% objective, and it allows you to whether you like it or not, it's going to tell you where you're strong and where you're weak at. But that's about the only way we use linear we promote linear, we don't use it here, is when you're starting and then you come in to a training system. We try to get you on our methods, which when people go the conjugate doesn't work. It just makes no sense to me, in that it has the most amount of freedom to use whatever aspects you need. Yeah. It's you have this huge toolbox, you can pull whatever you want, especially if you see something from that person is doing this, I'm just going to put that in here. But when you're locked into specific buckets that you have to do at specific times, you're locked in. And every week we know how fast, how strong they are, where they're weak at, how to improve upon it. And this feedback loop comes in. Circling back to the jiu-jitsu guys, that's where this becomes really useful, in that we have Max is coming off back-to-back competitions, a week break, going out for another competition. And if we didn't have the availability of variation, there's no way you could train. And there's a lot of people think that you can't train our peak. Well, you can. Lance Palmer came back from fight camp stronger. Yeah. Which people say, well, that's impossible. Well, he did. So clearly what he was doing during fight camp was maintaining and improving upon the level of strength. And Dan DePasqua had a real good one, that if you're maintaining, you're going backwards too. We're always trying to keep athletes moving forward because they don't stop. Yeah.
That's kind of a hallmark of the conjugate system, is the whole lack of detraining. Yeah. There's a strength and skill retention that's consistent year round, and you should be growing year round.
No doubt. And that to where, and if you're training optimally, really you don't need that many recovery days. More than likely you need recovery from your sport than you do so from the training aspect here. Being able to tell them exactly what to work on is huge, and that's the great with the feedback loop here. A good example of this is with Justin, who's pro lacrosse, which is a new sport to us in terms of working with. Been real interested in working with him. Phenomenal athlete to give feedback and input. In season, he went from a 315 to a 340 bench, which is pretty damn good for a lacrosse player or for anyone in that short space of time. But that was in 8 weeks, and 2 of those weeks were no max effort. We only had dynamic effort. And this was a highly trained athlete before he came here. And I was just fine-tuning some stuff and giving a level of structure, which helps create the culture, and then the group aspect of it. Because if Joe wasn't here, there's no way he would have pushed himself to get that right. That's the power of the group. Then he goes out and he has a level 1 strain or pull on his hamstring, comes back, rehabs in 5 weeks, does the therapy, does the training. His hamstrings by our standards are strong, right? To where we have measures on the inverse curl, we have measures on the standing hamstring curl. We do a lot of banded work, a lot of hip work. So compared to where we was at, he was definitely stronger. And 50 minutes into the game, level 2 tear. And like a lot of athletes, he was like, I've done something too much. I haven't done something at all. The therapy hasn't worked. It's always, usually we're the first to be on the chopping block. And thankfully he was open enough to talk about it. Okay, what's going on? Well, you start peeling back the layers Well, he had 13 hours of travel, 7 hours on an airplane. His recovery was in the dirt, and that's objective via his whoop and feeling like dirt. Didn't drink enough water and had new turf shoes he's never used before.
Yeah.
To where, even though we'll be biased, that's where I'm like, well, that's the unknown here.
Yeah.
More than likely, you were dehydrated, you weren't recovered enough, you were fatigued, and I believe strength training stopped you having a level 3 rupture.
Yeah, certainly.
Have you encountered anything similar to where working with athletes in that their mindset jumps from, well, it's the strength and conditioning's fault? It's not every other aspect of training.
Well, like we were just talking the other day with that coach that was here visiting.
Yeah.
You know, if you train max effort even 2 weeks prior to an injury, no matter what happened in between that and the game day that maybe caused the injury, the lifting will always, take the blame. But like you said, with the difference between a grade 2 and a grade 3 could have very well been the training. I agree with that. I mean, what our training does is it builds durability and resilience in an athlete. So I think that, you always have to look at the existential circumstances. You just can't pick apart the lifting. And that's probably has given strength training, and it has limited a lot of coaches to just speed training and work capacity training, because they're afraid to, push their athletes to a particular level because it's an insurance policy. They can, keep their head low and not have to, take the blame if something were to happen. I also think that's what makes us different here, is that we're willing to go past that and actually train athletes to a full capacity and make sure that they have that durability and absolute strength capacity to resist, high levels of force and dangerous circumstances in competition.
There's not many pro sports that doesn't have force coming in it, and it's the most violent thing that's going to happen to you. Like if you're in MMA, you're going to get hit. You're going to get slammed. You're going to get your joints locked up.
Yep.
Same in jiu-jitsu and grappling. So when you're in those aspects, like you can't have red tape when it comes to training. You have to be proficient, but our job is to make you as resilient as possible.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, right, to me, there's a clear line when it comes to training. There's training correctly and there's training incorrectly. And training incorrectly means you're not getting better, not getting stronger, not getting faster, and getting injured.
Yeah.
None of us want to do that.
No.
We're all in this pile of training correctly. And then it comes to level of efficacy, levels of the freedom to do what's needed. And that's obviously, we are in the most free training system you can do with conjugate. And that's what everyone's battling out about. So yes, you can get results in other systems, but for how long and to what extent? And when we go train or be as strong as necessary, well, we want our guys to be at the top level of that. We just want you to bare minimum. Just say if the prerequisite is 315, that's entry level. Like, well, if the top is 600, well, we want you 595 to 605. And that freedom is what I think sets us apart. And two, laying down what Louis did is not one of these guys paid to be here.
No.
And there's a freedom to that, to not having to be locked in, like to where our income is tied into them coming in here, in terms of our income is tied into us talking about how we train them and being as brutally honest as possible. Yeah. And we all know, and anyone who worked with Louis know, is that you didn't have to fear about him being brutally honest. You were going to get it whether you wanted it or not, and it was for your own benefit. And that's why we're lucky with the athletes we have and the athletes that are trying out to come here. And that diversity of athlete selection too makes you a hell of a better coach, rather than specialize in one given sport.
Yeah.
And then two, having you here, just even yesterday, allowed me to go, oh, I had forgotten about these aspects, because you get so wrapped up in you have a little bubble of like, okay, I coach these athletes, and you read within your own aperture. Where someone comes in and opens up. What has been your experience when it comes to athletes' understanding of strength?
Well, just to reiterate the point that something I've written about in articles is that if all skills and conditioning are equal, the stronger athletes are the more dominant athletes. And oftentimes the best athletes are the strongest athletes on the team. And I think that we, as we know, absolute strength is the king of all strengths. So as absolute strength increases, the capacity for all other strengths and athletic traits, opens up. You can become a better, you can become more explosive. You can become, faster.
Yeah.
So I think that, and I think a lot of athletes are waking up to that. A lot to do with Louis' work. Guys are starting to see that, strength training, like we were talking earlier in the grappling realm, that strength training does transfer. Absolute strength does transfer. Max effort training does transfer to sport. It's not just like a lot of coaches like to say, it's just a test or it's just to show.
Yeah.
No, there's transfer. I mean, when we're training above 90%, we're looking for largest motor unit recruitment. We're looking to enhance absolute strength, and that will transfer to sport. It always does. I mean, Louis used to talk about how, training athletes at times would get boring because he said it's just so easy. He was talking about like 40 times. He's like, you get them stronger, they run faster. And that used to, upset a lot of people when he said it, but he proved it. It's just is what it is. Strength training works. It's not all about, speed and work capacity, conditioning is very important, but it's half the equation. And if you're leaving the other half out, you're creating an athlete that is half as good as they potentially could be.
A question was brought up today in training was with weight jumps. When one of our guys was doing jumps, they'd warm up, and we, rule of thumb, have 7, right? We want it on the 7th set, you're trying to get it to where was waiting to take his biggest jump on the last set. What's your approach to putting in jumps to hitting a 1 rep max?
For a jump?
No, sorry, like the weight
jumping
changes.
in jumps and weight. Well, if you're working in a max effort, what you really want to do is you want to take enough warm-ups to feel prepared for the max, but you want to make big enough jumps that you're not pre-fatiguing to an extent that you're limiting your 1 rep max capability. And real, quick, something else I want to say about max effort training at Westside. A lot of guys think that we come in here on a weekly basis and absolutely kill ourselves trying to break all-time PRs. And the goal is just to train above 90%. We usually, of course, easily exceed 90%, but we always also leave a rep in the tank. So we're never killing an athlete.
It's a training max.
It's a training max.
Yeah.
Like we've discussed, I think we were talking about this today, where Louis would get upset if guys wouldn't listen when he said to shut it down. Because, a coach, if you're a good coach, you can tell, like, okay, that guy's about where he's going to start to lose technique, or he's going to put himself in a position to miss weight, which we don't want to miss, right? You want as few misses per year as you possibly can have. So that's a big important, especially when you're applying it to athletes to mitigate fatigue. Even if an athlete's in like you said, the competition schedule, if they're in an excessive period of competition where it's jiu-jitsu tournament once a weekend, or it's leave 2 sets in the tank.
Yeah.
But just try to get above that 90%. But at the same time, like, motor unit recruitment, you can still 5 rep max will train, will enhance absolute strength because, rep 4 and 5 recruits larger motor units, right? So there's a lot of ways to attack that and still mitigate fatigue and not, kill your athletes.
Back to the jumps. How do you do it?
Oh, the jumps. Yeah, I should touch on that. So, like I said, you want the fastest path to your max, but you just want to make sure that you have enough time to warm up and feel ready. But other than that, yeah, I just try to get directly to it. I think if you're like I think I wrote an article, if you're getting to like 800, like say if you're going to pull like an 800-pound deadlift, you can get there within 6 to 7 sets if you're trained.
Yeah. But I remember Lou going crazy that you weren't starting with 100-pound plates.
Yeah.
Because if you're an 800-pound puller, why the fuck are you starting with 135 pounds? Because
Yeah.
the 7 jumps was like to where
What's it do?
And for whatever reason, I got caught in the middle of all you guys deadlifting. And I remember it was 100-pound plate, 1 jump, 100-pound plate, 2 jump. I'm like, then it was 100-pound plate, Tom's off the bus.
Yeah.
But like that's to where, and it made perfect sense. To where number 7, like you were right there. To where, well, why would you make all these unnecessary jumps? And we had this with when Mac first came here. Mac was in such a rush to get his PR or go straight for it. He was forget about set 4, 5, and 6 and just go straight to 7.
Yeah.
And losing those reps is equally as like a detrimental to where there's a certain amount of volume and repetition you need working up to a max.
Yeah. It's a preparedness, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you obviously need to come in prepared prior to the workout, but there's also you need to prepare yourself within the workout for that top set.
Yeah. And there's some days you get greedy days.
Yeah.
I mean, Harold Sharp knows all about greedy training, but to where you're playing that game of like, well, I know I'm going to take you out, and I'm going to make a 2.5 or 5 pound jump, and then wait till you make too big of a jump, and they're okay sprinkled in along the way. But everything here is a rule of thumb. Like the fine science of like, well, I have to do it in 7. Like sometimes you'll do it in 5. Sometimes you're feeling it. Some days you're just not feeling it at all. And you take smaller jumps. Your central nervous system, we know so little about it, even though we all think we know a lot more than we actually do.
Yeah.
Is that some days it's just absolutely cooked from stuff that's not lifting wise. And working with athletes, the more I realize like external aspects crush training.
Yeah.
And having the variety in the selection of, that's usually when we bring in something like a high pin press or high pin pull, or maybe a partial or a belt squat max, for something that we know we're going to achieve a maximum in.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be that long, grueling grind that everyone thinks is. Where I think we get people is how dense our training is.
Yeah.
That we're trying to accomplish a lot in a short space of time.
Yep. It's conditioning within the training, right?
Yeah.
And back to what you were just saying about modifying the lifts, we've caught a lot of hell over our, lack of range of motion in particular lifts, high rack pulls or high pin press or whatever. But, manipulating joint angles is one way to not just mitigate fatigue, but work around fatigue and still, deliver meaningful stimulus to an athlete, And that's the ultimate goal on a training day to training day basis. Get the most out of it.
It drove me nuts with athletes, especially who are not powerlifters, or not they're not in that sport. They're crushing on the field or in their sport. So clearly the transfer is there. And we're just trying to really give them more access to themselves. The more you tap into that central nervous system, it really does seem to carry over to sport specific. Yeah. So this training generally is more specific than bin specific. Do you have any sports that you trend to want to work with more than the others?
Well, I think just because of the lineage here, working with combat sports athletes, grapplers, that's always enjoyable because they have an aggressive mindset. They're really easy to train because they want to train.
Yeah.
And this is not to disrespect other athletes, but they're tough guys, so they can tolerate a full training week with no problem. But I think I enjoy a challenge. I mean, I like to adapt the system to all sports. So really, I wouldn't turn an athlete down because they're in a particular sport. I think it's cool to see what the conjugate method can do, or prove what the conjugate method can do. I mean, look at the diverse sports Louis worked with. I mean, he's proven that at pretty much any sport, as long as we can identify the strengths and the athletic traits needed for the athlete, we can deliver the stimulus to create the adaptation.
What's the most unique sport you've worked with?
Probably rugby, I guess. But I mean, I've worked with football players, rugby players, and a lot of combat sports athletes, and one basketball player. But other than that, nothing too crazy. Nothing like high lie or anything like that.
That's a freaking crazy game too.
It is. It's pretty crazy.
What of all the sports we've worked with so far, golf blew my mind.
Oh yeah.
For actually, when you're a PGA level golfer still to this day, I cannot believe how much you walk, about 11 or 12 miles per day. Your hand-eye coordination has to be on point all times. How close the spectators are to you, the amount of stuff that is non-sports, like between advertisements and everything. And then the amount of snake oil salesmen that surround this sport.
Yeah.
It absolutely was, it was crazy to me. And then, too, how athletic golfers are.
Yeah.
That was another thing that was like a level of ignorance I had before working with him. That's definitely one of the most interesting. And like getting back to the system, we just trained so generally, and the carryover was crazy. Not to like club head speed, but just the resiliency of what golf does to you. Like you're dealing with torque and anti-torque vectors coming into the body that you're trying to figure out, and the importance of actually having not just hip mobility, but actually strength, being able to turn over into that.
Yep.
So right now we have 5 more athletes coming here to try out, to work with, see if they make it. Anyone listening or watching who wants to apply here, there'll be a link down below in the menu. Any questions you have, make sure to get them in. This is the way we're going to format our podcast, where Burley and myself will go back and forth on what we're doing with athletes. A big shout out to our sponsors in the links below for being able to do all this. This allows us to give you this content for free, and allows us to do what Louis always did, was trying to push out as much stuff for everyone to learn from, to ask questions on. We do have our membership site, where if you want to get into more nitty-gritty of this and other aspects, we have a whole community forum in there, which allows us to spend more time digging in deep. But until next time, Burley, I appreciate it.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank everyone else. And see you next time.